Somewhere out in the Western Sea, past the Somerset Isles, past the last charted waters on any reliable map, there is an archipelago that most Tamrielic scholars refuse to visit. Not because the journey is particularly hard, not because getting there is some unsolvable puzzle. They refuse because the creatures that live there once deliberately engineered a disease so catastrophic that it killed more than half of every living person on the continent of Tamriel. They did it on purpose, calmly, with full intention. And then, while the plague was still spreading and people were still dying in the streets by the millions, those same creatures sailed their ships to the coastlines and started raiding cities to scoop up slaves. They watched Tamriel burn and they thought, great, now's a good time to go shopping. These things are called the Slode, and they might be the single most quietly horrifying race in all of Elder Scrolls lore. I say quietly because unlike, say, the Daedra, who are bombastic and dramatic and love a good monologue, the Slode do not announce themselves. They do not make speeches. They do not gloat. They plan. They sit in their coral-encrusted lagoons for years at a time, slowly working through a problem the way you might slowly work through an ice bath. And then, when the moment is right, they act, and everything they planned goes exactly the way they said it would. Their whole cultural mythology is built around the idea that hasty action equals death. The word for adventure in their language is most closely translated as tragic disaster. That tells you everything. So today we are going all the way in on the Slode, where they came from, what they actually look like, how they live, why every race in Tamriel would rather share a dinner table with a Daedric prince than be in the same ocean as one of these things, and what some of the most interesting and genuinely unsettling lore surrounding them actually means for the broader Elder Scrolls universe. Stick with me because this one goes deep. Also, another shout out to Derico, aka Hopeless Noob, for sending in today's gameplay. If you also play any Elder Scrolls games and want your gameplay featured in a video, you can use the form in the description. Let's start at the beginning, which in this case means starting with what a Slode actually is, physically, because the way they look is part of the story. Picture a toad. Now make the toad enormous. Give it the body proportions of something that has never once thought about whether it was eating too much. Give it a face that looks like someone pushed a normal face inward very firmly with the palm of their hand. Add eyes. And make those eyes wrong in a way that is hard to describe but immediately recognizable when you see it. The kind of eyes that suggest the thing behind them has spent a very long time thinking about things that would rearrange your sense of reality if you could even begin to understand them. One in-universe description from a traveler encountering a Slode in dim torchlight describes exactly this. The creature glowed with a disgusting wetness. Its face was squished and slug-like. The belly was rotund, and the eyes were the worst part, because in them you could see what the writer called forbidden knowledge and boundless horrors. That is a Slode. They are semi-aquatic, which means they can move both on land and in water, though the water is really where they shine. On land, adult Slode move with the energy and enthusiasm of a very old, very large boulder. They are slow. Their grip is weak because their hands, while functional, are not built for the kind of dexterous tool use that most humanoid races take for granted. Their bulk works against them on dry ground. The thing that makes them genuinely scary on land is this. Every single land-traveling Slode knows the recall spell at a very high level of skill, and they use it the way you might use a car, not as a last resort. Not as an emergency button, just casually, instinctively. If things get difficult, they teleport out. If they need to get somewhere, they teleport there. The Pocket Guide to the Empire literally notes this as their primary mode of travel and best defense. You cannot corner a Slode, you cannot trap one. The moment you get close enough to do anything about it, it is simply gone. In water, it is a completely different situation. Especially in the brackish lagoon at the center of their archipelago home, the Thrassian archipelago, the Slode move with what accounts describe as relative quickness and grace, through a network of coral formations and ancient shipwrecks. In their element, they navigate underwater passages the way fish do, effortlessly, like the bulk that makes them awkward on land simply ceases to be a problem once the water is holding it up. And given that some of them get so old and so large that they literally cannot support their own weight outside of water without collapsing, this matters a lot. The oldest Slode are purely aquatic creatures out of sheer necessity. Which brings us to how they grow. Because the Slode life cycle is one of the weirdest things in Elder Scrolls biology, and it matters for understanding pretty much everything about their culture. So a Slode starts its life as what Bendu Olo, the admiral who eventually led the war against them, called disgusting little amorphous grubs. Blunt man. Accurate though. The larvae are tiny. They are non-sentient at this stage. They lack any recognizable intelligence. They are just these small shapeless things wriggling around on the Thrassian atolls, ignored by their parents. Completely ignored. The adult Slode do not raise their young. They do not check on them. They do not feel any particular way about them. The grubs hatch or emerge, or whatever the right word is, for something that starts as an amorphous blob, and then they are on their own. Somehow they make their way to the sea, which, when you are a tiny, non-sentient grub, is probably a journey of absolutely harrowing stakes, and once they reach the water, they go through a transformation. They become polwygles. A polwygle is what a Slode looks like during adolescence, and it looks nothing like an adult. It is described as an aquatic quasi-cephalopod, basically an octopus-adjacent creature. It cannot survive on dry land at this stage. It needs the water to live. And this is the part that gets deeply unsettling, because the adult Slode, those massive corpulent beings wallowing in the shallow lagoons, will occasionally reach out with their pseudopods and catch the polwygles. The slow ones, the ones that cannot get out of the way fast enough. And those captured polwygles get processed into one of the most interesting alchemical ingredients in Elder Scrolls lore, Slode soap. This is a real item in Morrowind. You can find it. Slode soap is made by taking captured polwygles, which again are the adolescent form of the Slode themselves, tossing them into a cauldron and letting them break down into a slimy broth. That broth gets mixed with alchemical materials only the Slode know, poured into molds and cooled. The bars are useful in alchemy for agility and personality-related effects, but more importantly, the Slode use the soap as a core component in their necromantic rituals. Having a reagent made from your own descendants apparently acts as a profound intensifier in the magic of undeath, which raises so many questions about what necromancy actually is in the Elder Scrolls universe that we could do a whole separate video on that alone. The casual callousness of this is what makes it so characteristically Slode. Cruelty has nothing to do with it. They are applying logic. The weak larvae that cannot avoid getting caught are, by Slode standards, a waste of resources in their current state. Better to make them useful. Pure practicality. The coldest possible kind. Most other races find it absolutely impossible to stomach. By the time a Slode reaches adulthood, it has passed through the grub stage and the polwygle stage and emerged into the thing people actually think of when they hear the word big, slug-toed hybrid humanoid. Glistening, wrong eyes. And at this point, the pocket guide notes something strange. The adult form does not apparently reproduce at all. They show no interest whatsoever in the fate of their offspring. They produce young, abandon them entirely, and then move through the rest of what can be an extraordinarily long life with zero ongoing investment in whether any of those young survive. The children they do produce are left to fend for themselves, and the ones who survive were simply the ones fast enough to avoid being used as soap. It is natural selection, but run by the same creatures doing the selecting, Adults keep growing, they keep aging. There appears to be no upper limit on either. Some Slode are so old and so massive that, as we said, they cannot support themselves on land, but they are still alive, still thinking. The sheer scale of an ancient Slode, centuries or possibly millennia old, wallowing in the deep waters of Thras, is something the lore hints at but never quite fully explores, and that restraint, that leaving it at the edge of your imagination, is what makes it so genuinely atmospheric. There is one reference in the lore to something called the Elder Distended One, a diplomat's journal written before the year 2260 of the First Era, describes being brought to an audience in a submerged tower. The journal is badly damaged, and Tellinger the Artificer, one of Esau's most reliable in-universe scholarly voices, can only make out fragments of what follows. But what survives describes an impressively corpulent body, a strangely pulsating head, and then, on its belly, 3 eyes, eyes that opened again as toothless mouths. And from those mouths, something was disgorged that the attendants around it eagerly consumed. Tellinger cannot say what this creature was. He notes it is the first real glimpse into potential cultural leadership among the Slode, and he leaves it there. The horror of that image, and then just the hard stop and moving on, is extremely effective writing. Right, so now that we know what a Slode looks and lives like, we should talk about where they actually come from and what their home is actually like, because Thras is a fascinating place. The Thrassian archipelago sits west of Tamriel in the Abetian Sea, sometimes called the Sea of Pearls in other sources. It is a group of islands in roughly a semicircular arrangement, like a partially submerged coral atoll. The first maps drawn by cartographers who sailed there and managed to return show 16 islands. Later, maps show different numbers. The sizes change. The geography shifts in ways that do not line up with any natural explanation. Some scholars have theorized, and this is one of those lore threads that never got definitively confirmed or denied, that Thras itself might be a living organism. The coral, the whole structure of the place, might be alive in some way the Slode understand and perhaps maintain through their necromantic practices. Think about that for a second. An entire archipelago that is itself a creature. That would explain why, after the All Flags Navy literally sank it into the ocean using magic, it eventually came back up. You can drown a living thing temporarily, but you cannot just decide it stays drowned if it wants to surface again. The permanent, consistent feature of Thras is the brackish lagoon at the center of the island chain, surrounded by all those coral formations and sunken ships. This is where the Slode are actually fastest, most maneuverable, most themselves. Everything around that lagoon can change. The lagoon stays. It is the beating heart of the place, if something that might be a living archipelago can be said to have a heart. The Slode build primarily in coral. Their architecture, such as it is, grows from the sea. The most famous and lore-significant structure they ever built was called the Coral Tower. It stood on Agonio, the largest and most stable of the Thracian islands, and the lore suggests it may have been something far beyond the building. In Elder Scrolls lore, there is a concept called the Towers of Nirn. These massive arcane structures that each tie into and help maintain the fundamental structure of reality on Nirn. The crystal-like Claw Tower in the Somerset Isles, Red Mountain in Morrowind, White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil. Each of them is connected to something called a stone, which is the power source and the metaphysical anchor for what the tower does. The Coral Tower of Thras may have been one of these. Tellinger the Artificer, when asked directly about this, says that from all accounts the Coral Tower acted as both a focus and projector of mystical power, which is very much in line with how the towers function. He stops short of confirming it is a real tower because, well, the Coral Tower does not exist anymore. It was destroyed when the All Flags Navy came to Thras, and the destruction of that tower is what caused the great whirlpool that sank the archipelago. After Thras resurfaced, the Slode built something new. The Pillar of Thras. It is described as a 1,000-foot tall spiral of coral, 1,000 feet, that is taller than any building humans have managed in the real world as of this video being made. It sits above a massive permanent whirlpool called the Maelstrom of Baal, and it is used for sacrifice. The Slode bring Slode to the top of this 1,000-foot spiral and throw them off. Some die when they are dashed on the rocks below. A few vanish before impact, seemingly disappearing into oblivion. The Pillar of Thras is thought by many scholars to be a reconstruction of the Coral Tower, but a failed or incomplete one. It might be an attempt to rebuild what was lost, to reactivate whatever the Coral Tower was doing metaphysically, and it either cannot quite get there, or the effort to do so requires regular sacrifice to keep whatever power it generates, even partially running. The connection to the Maelstrom of Baal, named for Moloch Baal, the Daedric prince of domination and the architect of the Planameld in ESO, is interesting on its own. There is an implication that this whirlpool leads somewhere, or that Moloch Baal has some interest in what the Slode are doing there. The All Flags Navy's account of sinking Thras mentions that about half the fleet got pulled into a great whirlpool created when the Coral Tower fell, and according to some sources those ships ended up in Cold Harbor, Moloch Baal's realm. Whether that is coincidence, whether Moloch Baal has some ongoing arrangement with the Slode, whether the Coral Tower was tied to Cold Harbor in some way, none of that gets answered. Elder Scrolls lore loves dangling these threads just close enough for you to see them, and just far enough away that you cannot quite grab them. Now let's talk about who the Slode actually are as a people, because their culture and psychology are just as interesting as their biology, and they inform everything about why their history played out the way it did. The Slode have a personality type that in-universe sources describe consistently and in blunt terms. They are greedy, they are self-absorbed. Every known individual, Slode, has been described as a grasping, callous, godless, self-loving schemer. They are capable of brilliant diplomacy, they understand social performance, but they do not actually feel what they appear to be expressing when they engage in social performance. They are, as one source puts it, skilled actors producing gross, exaggerated parodies of human behavior. They can smile, they can negotiate, they can be perfectly reasonable in conversation. None of it is genuine in the way you experience genuine emotion. It is all calculated output, chosen because it gets results. The Slode have no compunctions about theft, torture, kidnapping, murder, genocide, or breaking any law they decide is inconvenient. Not because they are chaotic, not because they enjoy transgression, because they run every decision through a purely rational calculation of benefit versus cost, and if the calculation says break the law, they break the law. The reason they follow any agreements at all is because their calculation usually also tells them that predictable behavior from others produces better long-term outcomes, and being trustworthy enough to be worth making deals with is a calculable advantage. So they will honor a deal when honoring it serves their interests, and violate it when it does not, with the same emotional involvement you might have when choosing which street to drive down. There is one exception to this emotional flatness that stands out in the sources, and it is strange enough to be worth noting. The Slode have a cheerful affinity for those who defeat them or trick them in any endeavor. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to respect and perhaps even warmth, which, given everything else described about them, reads as genuinely alien. If you beat a Slode at something, they actually like you for it. It almost implies a kind of appreciation for competence that transcends the self-interest calculation, as if the quality of the loss registers to them as interesting in a way that other experiences do not. It is the closest thing to a normal emotional response they have, and it is triggered specifically by getting outsmarted. Their mythology reflects everything about how they see the world. In Slode hero stories, the heroes are always slow, deliberate, careful. They spend years considering a problem before acting. They consult with older, wiser Slode. They wait, and when they finally move, they succeed completely. The villains in these stories are always quick thinkers. They act fast. They improvise. They respond to the moment rather than planning ahead. And they always fail catastrophically. These stories skip the good versus evil framing entirely. They are cautionary tales about methodology, about what happens when you mistake speed for skill. The word for adventure in their language, being translated as tragic disaster, tells you that in Slode mythology, the adventurer, the person who rushes headlong into situations on gut instinct and hope, is the villain. They are the one who gets everyone killed. Every culture's mythology shapes its values, and Slode mythology shapes a culture that prioritizes patience and deliberation as the highest possible virtues, not because they are morally superior, but because history keeps proving those values tactically correct. This tracks with what they actually do. They plan for years, decades, possibly longer. The Somerset expansion of ESO shows Sea Slode, who had been running a slow, patient infiltration of the Crystal Tower and the Eltmeri Sapiarchs for what would have been an enormous stretch of time, building up control before anyone noticed. That is the Slode way, not the dramatic assault, the quiet, slow, inexorable tightening of grip until by the time anyone realizes what is happening, it is too late. Let's also talk for a moment about their relationship with other races in practical terms, because the Slode do engage with the wider world in specific, calculated ways. They are known as excellent merchants and smugglers. The same cold calculation that makes them terrifying in warfare makes them deeply reliable in commerce, at least for as long as a deal benefits them. They buy slaves in Ter, the Dunmer city in Morrowind, which tells you that the Slode slave trade was operating across the sea with enough regularity that port cities in Morrowind had standing arrangements to sell people to them. Those people got loaded onto ships, taken to Thras, and used in necromantic operations. A real, ongoing business described matter-of-factly in multiple sources. The airships mentioned in some Third Era sources are one of those details that opens up a whole world of questions. The Slode, a race primarily known for the sea, apparently also have airships. These ships are described as carrying corpses from Senchal in elsewhere back to Thras. So they are traveling through the air, covering enormous distances, picking up bodies. This raises questions about Slode technology that the lore has never fully answered. How do these ships fly? Are they enchanted? Do they use some kind of corpse-fueled magic that the Slode, given everything we know about their necromancy, could absolutely have developed? Are they alive in the same way Thras itself might be alive? Nobody has gotten close enough to a Slode airship and survived the experience to write a useful account of what makes them work. Their necromancy deserves its own moment of attention because it is so deeply woven into everything they are. The Altmer, who spent more time thinking about necromancy as a philosophical problem than probably any other race, trace their cultural hostility to the dark arts directly back to the Slode. Every story the Altmer tell about necromancy as something unclean is colored by millennia of the Slode doing it to them, to their dead, to their captured people. But the Slode relationship with necromancy goes beyond just reanimating corpses. They use it for research. They use it to build armies. They use it in rituals connected to their tower. They use it to make soap. It permeates every aspect of their existence so thoroughly that it is less a school of magic they practice and more a lens through which they see the world. One thing that does not come up enough in discussions of the Slode is what all this necromancy is ultimately for. The Slode collect bodies, they raise the dead, they refine their craft across centuries. They seem to be working towards something, building something, understanding something about the nature of souls and death that other races have not gotten to yet. The connection to the Coral Tower, the possible connection to Cold Harbor, the ongoing ritualistic use of the Pillar of Thras. All of it suggests a long-term project that the Thrassian War interrupted but did not end. The Slode are patient. They were set back by the All Flags Navy. They are still working. They have an interesting relationship with religion. Officially, the Slode do not worship gods. The Pocket Guide to the Empire calls them a godless tribe, and that word is doing real work. They perform Daedric rituals occasionally, but not as acts of faith, as business transactions. If summoning and offering something to a Daedric prince produces a calculably useful result, the Slode will do it, with the same attitude you might have calling a plumber, transactional, completely without reverence. The one apparent exception, the one figure in the wider cosmos that the Slode seem to genuinely regard with something resembling respect, is Manimarco, the King of Worms, the greatest necromancer in Tamrielic history. This makes complete sense, because the Slode revere mastery of necromancy above almost anything else, and Manimarco represents the absolute ceiling of what that mastery can achieve. He became a god. He literally transcended mortality through the discipline that the Slode considered their highest art. In-universe sources note that the Slode already thought of him as a kind of hero figure even before his apotheosis. After he became the god of worms, Slode priests who, as a culture, rejected all forms of worship, came to communicate with him, to seek him out. That matters. That is the closest thing to religious behavior the Slode have ever exhibited. Manimarco's relationship with the Slode predates his deification by a long time. He gave the isle near Strosmkai to the Slode necromancer Ngasta. His worm cult had ongoing dealings with Thras going back to the time of the Planemeld. The connection between the greatest Altmeri necromancer and the race of slug people who arguably started necromancy as a widespread practice in Tamriel runs deep. These are groups with aligned goals and mutual respect, operating together for reasons of pure self-interest and shared craft. And speaking of Ngasta, let's talk about him, because he is the most significant individual Slode in all of Elder Scrolls, and most players have interacted with him without fully realizing what they were dealing with. The Elder Scrolls Adventures. Redguard came out in 1998. Most people skipped it. If you have never touched it, you are in the majority. But in terms of lore importance, it contributed enormously to the Elder Scrolls universe, including giving us the first and most detailed look at a Slode character in any game. Ngasta the Slode lives on a small island near Stros Mkai in Hammerfell during the late Second Era, at the time of Tiber Septim's conquest of the region. The island is named after him, the Isle of Ngasta. His island is the kind of place that makes sense when you understand what a Slode actually is. It always rains there, the sky is always dark, bats circle. The water around it has tentacles from something unknown breaking the surface. The island is mostly a massive graveyard, because when the Redguards first came to Tamriel from Yokura, they brought a custom of burying criminals on islands off the coast to keep their spirits from troubling the living. Ngasta found this extremely convenient. A pre-stocked laboratory, graves full of bodies, a location already associated with death and distance from civilized society. He moved in. He is a servant of two masters, Clavicus Vile, the Daedric prince, and Manimarco, the king of worms, who is described in the game as Ngasta's liege lord, and who gave him those hunting grounds. This layered allegiance makes sense for a Slode. He serves whoever is most useful to serve. Clavicus Vile receives souls in exchange for granting Ngasta favors. Manimarco provided the territory and presumably patronage. Ngasta provides both of them with results. His main project on the isle is the Soul Snare. He has cast a net of necromantic energy over Stros Mkai, the main island nearby, that intercepts the souls of anyone who dies there without proper holy rites. The souls get pulled in, they come to Ngasta, and he sends them along to Clavicus Vile, who adds them to his collection, the nature of which is typically not something vile is forthcoming about. What Ngasta gets in return for this arrangement is access to an enormous stock of souls for necromantic experimentation, the favor of a Daedric prince, and the protection that comes with both. He has also stocked his island with undead, skeletons, zombies, raised from the graves that cover most of the isle. When Cyrus the Redguard arrives on Strozum Kai in the game, he is looking for his sister Izara, who has gone missing. What he eventually discovers is that Izara had gone to Ngasta herself before Cyrus arrived, desperate enough to ask a Slode for help restoring Prince Ator, the Redguard prince who was supposed to be dead. Ngasta offered to do it in exchange for her soul. She agreed. He took the soul. Then he gave it to Clavicus Vile, which is not, technically speaking, the same as refusing to help, but it is absolutely the Slode approach to a deal. Cyrus has to go to Ngasta's island himself to get his sister's soul back, and then recover Ator's soul gems separately to have any chance of restoring the prince. The conversation you have with Ngasta when you reach the tower and confront him is one of the most stylistically interesting villain conversations in any of the classic Elder Scrolls games. He speaks about himself in the third person. His dialogue is measured and strange, and somehow manages to convey both contempt for the person he is talking to and complete indifference to whether they live or die. He describes his soul snare in terms that are almost poetic: aether hounds patrolling the gates of death, a siren song of semiotics. The menace arrives with no performance behind it. He just sounds like a creature that has spent so long around death and so long thinking about death at a level most people cannot reach that the language it uses for these things has become genuinely alien to anyone else. Clavicus Vile, in one of the game's lore books, describes Ngasta as a character of remarkable charm and complexity. Vile also notes that Ngasta was functionally afraid of him, which again fits perfectly. The Slode calculate risk. Clavicus Vile is someone whose potential consequences, if angered, are essentially incalculable. You do not take that risk. You manage the relationship carefully. Ngasta feared Vile the way you might fear a bomb you are forced to carry around, not because the bomb hates you, but because the consequences of getting it wrong are absolute. In the game's ending, Cyrus defeats Ngasta by using the Flask of Lilendril to absorb the Necromancer's spells and reflect them back. 7 hits and Ngasta dissolves into a blue puddle that fades away. Cyrus observes, in what might be the most thematically satisfying detail of the whole fight, that Ngasta may have been caught in his own soul snare as he died. The very trap he built to harvest other people's souls might have taken his. Whether that actually happened, whether Ngasta's soul went to Clavicus Vile or somewhere else, is never clarified. But Ngasta's influence extends well beyond that battle. His book, Ngasta, Kvata, Kvakis, written in the Slode language, shows up in copies across Vardenfell in Morrowind and keeps getting referenced throughout the series. And then there is Hackdirt. Hackdirt is a small, deeply creepy village in Cyrodiil that shows up in Oblivion as the location of a quest called A Shadow over Hackdirt. It is clearly a reference to the HP, Lovecraft story A Shadow over Innsmouth, which is itself about a town of people who made a deal with creatures from the deep sea in exchange for wealth and started turning into something inhuman. In Hackdirt, miners found something in the caverns beneath the town. They called these things the Deep Ones. The villagers built a religion around them, rededicated their chapel, started demanding blood sacrifices, eventually committed enough murders that the Imperial Legion showed up, burned most of the town down, and drove the Deep Ones away. By the time you arrive in Oblivion, the town is a ruin. The surviving cultists are paranoid and hostile to outsiders, and the caverns still produce ominous growling sounds. The thing that connects this to the Slode is the Bible of the Deep Ones. This book is written in the Daedric alphabet, so most players would have to translate it to read it. And what you get when you do translate it is a text that is, in large sections, essentially identical to Ngasta, Kvata, Kvakis, the Slode necromancer's obscure book. The language the Deep Ones taught to the founder of Hackdirt's cult is the Slode language, or something so close to it that the distinction may not exist. The Deep Ones down in those caves, whatever they were, had some connection to Ngasta, or to Slode culture, or to Slode religion, in whatever form it takes. Whether the Deep Ones are literally Slode living under Cyrodiil, whether they are some related or derivative creature, whether Ngasta himself had some hand in establishing the cult, none of that is answered. The game leaves you with the clue and lets you sit with the implications. Bethesda at their most effective in terms of environmental storytelling. In Skyrim, there is a ship called the Dainty Slode. It sits in the water near Solitude and is involved in one of the Thieves Guild quests. The ship is named after these creatures. That alone is interesting. The Slode are creatures most people in Tamriel have never seen in person, and yet someone named their ship after them, which tells you something about how they exist in the cultural imagination. They are the thing you name your scary ship after, the thing you invoke as if the name itself wards off something, or maybe draws it. Now let's get into the Thrassian Plague, because this is the biggest single event in Slode history, and it is staggering in its scale. The year is 2200 of the First Era. That timing matters, because the First Era runs for more than 2800 years total. So we are talking about a period when Tamriel already has functioning civilizations with history and culture and significant populations. People have cities, they have institutions. The Alessian Empire is the dominant political force. The world is imperfect but organized and functional and alive in all the ways a world should be. And then the Slode release a plague. It is artificial, deliberately engineered. The Slode spread it using infected sea beasts that they drove onto the coastlines, starting from the western shores closest to Thras, a disease designed to move, to spread, to kill. And it worked beyond any scale that even the Slode might have predicted, or possibly exactly to the scale they predicted, because, remember, these are creatures who plan for years before acting. The plague spreads inland from the western coast. It reaches as far east as elsewhere. It kills more than half of the entire population of Tamriel. Not a province. The continent, more than half. Gone. Let that settle in. You have a population of, say, whatever Tamriel's total headcount is in the First Era, and more than half of them die. The knock-on effects of something like that are enormous. Cities that took centuries to build suddenly have nobody left to maintain the infrastructure. Trade networks collapse because there are not enough people to run them. Agricultural systems fail. Political structures built around certain power balances lose entire portions of their participant base. The Khajiit of elsewhere were devastated. Their entire political structure fractured under the population loss, and the region never fully stabilized in the way it had been before. Valenwood was so weakened that Raman Cyrodiil was able to conquer it centuries later, specifically because it never fully recovered. The War of Righteousness that ended the Alessian Order's 1,000-year rule grew directly from the political realignments the plague forced. One artificially created disease cascaded across centuries of subsequent history, and while the plague was spreading, the Slode raided. They hit cities along the southern coast. They pillaged. They enslaved people. They took advantage of the chaos in exactly the way a patient, calculating species that had been planning this would do. The chaos of the dying was a feature, something to exploit. It created conditions under which coastal cities were too overwhelmed to organize meaningful defense. The reason they did this is unclear, and scholars in the in-universe texts note this explicitly. Some think it was preparation for a large-scale invasion that never fully launched because the All Flags Navy responded faster than expected. Some think the Slode simply wanted access to Tamrielic bodies for necromantic research, and the plague created a supply. Others note that the motivations of a species that does not experience emotions the way Tamrielic races do might not map neatly onto human legible reasons. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither, and the actual reason was something so alien to the way Tamrielic scholars think that they cannot recognize it even when looking directly at the evidence. What is clear is that it took several decades before Tamriel's nations decided collectively to do something about it. Eventually, most of Tamriel was convinced the Slode were responsible. Then, the Alessian emperor agreed to fund a proposal by Bendu Olo, the Colovian king of Anvil, to build a navy and go to Thras. The assault on Thras itself happened in 1E 2260, roughly 60 years after the plague began. Bendu Olo became Baron Admiral of what became known as the All Flags Navy, and the name is almost literal. Ships and sailors from Redguard, Breton, Colovian, Argonian, Altmer, Dunmer, Khajiit, Orc, and Nord, ancient enemies, races that had been at war with each other, came together because the Slode had managed to do something none of those internal conflicts had: make all of Tamriel recognize a common enemy. One account from a Black Marsh freebooter notes that it was the most extraordinary fleet he had ever seen: Colovian galleys, Redguard corsairs, Breton warships, Aldmeri cutters, all sailing together, unimaginable under any other circumstances. There are even obscure accounts that mention Marmor, Drow, and dragons being involved, though those sources are less reliable. The actual approach to Thras was rough. The Slode came out fighting. They deployed sea beasts, enormous creatures, blighted whales described as festering and wrong, that rose from the water and attacked the fleet. Slode riders on their backs launched spells of profane power and magic that the elves in the fleet experienced as agonizing, like their heads were being pulled apart. The beasts sprayed acidic ichor that could dissolve sailor and ship alike, and only stopped when set on fire. The fleet had to figure out how to counter these creatures before it could even get close to Thras, and the text strongly implies that Archmage Sirabane, a legendary figure who was himself at this point either a very powerful human mage or possibly a Daedra-adjacent entity, had a hand in cracking that problem. The greatest of the sea creatures was the Molmor, described as a cross between a whale and an octopus the size of a mountain, with a forest of spines each longer than a knight's lance. It was impervious to every attack the navy tried. A young druid from a circle called the Eldertide eventually killed it, or rather petrified it, by tricking it into swallowing an enchanted clod of ground that turned it to stone. The petrified Molmor still exists in the lore as Molmor Islet, a rock formation in the sea, the frozen corpse of a monster large enough to be an island. When the fleet finally reached Thras itself, they came through 2 days of fierce storms that grew stronger as they approached. A dense fog, whispers in the wind, the stench of rot. A solid cloud encircling the islands. Bendu Olo's image appeared on the decks of every ship simultaneously, a magical projection, and issued orders to sack the largest island and lay siege to the coral tower. The assault began, and then the blue light at the top of the coral tower started to pulse. It bled energy into the clouded sky. The island cracked. It sank. The sinking created a massive whirlpool that pulled in roughly half the fleet. Those ships are gone, absorbed into Cold Harbor, the realm of Molag Bal, according to the sources that attempt to account for them. The surviving ships sailed to the Sistras, the archipelago where the fleet had originally been built, and there the captains signed something called the Concordat of Fraternity, binding their races to a commitment to peace. One of the side effects of going to war against a species horrible enough to unite everyone is that you come out the other side having discovered you can actually work together. The All Flags Navy's aftermath shifted politics across Tamriel significantly. The Colovian West's military glory from the campaign gave it enough prestige to eventually overshadow the eastern Nibene heartland, which fed into the War of Righteousness years later. A chain of events starting with sea creatures carrying plague ended with reshaping which part of Cyrodiil would eventually dominate. The Slode did not go extinct. Thras rose again. It takes time, and no one is entirely sure how, but the archipelago came back. The Slode never attempted anything like the Thrassian Plague again, but they did not disappear either. They pulled back into their isolationist mode. They continued raiding on a smaller scale near Hammerfell. Reports of Slode along the coast near Strozum Kai and other Hammerfell islands persist well into the Third Era. They buy slaves from Ter in Morrowind. There are rumors of Slode airships, and yes, that is in the lore, Slode airships that carry corpses from Senchal in Elsewhere back to Thras for necromantic use. They operate on the edges of Tamrielic society, never fully gone, always present enough to remain in collective memory as the worst thing the sea has to offer, which sets up Esso's Somerset chapter beautifully. By the time of Eso, the Second Era, the threat of the Slode takes a new form. There is a subspecies, or perhaps a related species, called the Sea Slode. The regular Slode are concerning enough on their own. The Sea Slode are something else entirely. They are described as more colorful than their Thrassian cousins. They are bioluminescent, which means they glow in deep water. They have long antennae. They resemble nudibranchs rather than land slugs, basically sea slugs instead of land slugs, and they live in underwater kingdoms in the Sea of Pearls. One of their known realms is called Ulvor Kus. Unlike the regular Slode, who organize into small kingdoms, Sea Slode tend to form cabals, temporary alliances built around specific goals that dissolve and reform as those goals change. They are even more reclusive than the Thrassian Slode. And where regular Slode specialize primarily in necromancy, the Sea Slode have a significantly broader magical toolkit. Necromancy, yes, alchemy, shadow magic, mind magic, and that last one is the real nightmare. In the Second Era, a Sea Slode cabal, called the Abyssal Cabal, decides it wants Somerset back. The assumption being that the Slode may have originally lived on Somerset, or at least that Somerset was historically connected to their domain, which tracks with those oldest coral ruins on the island being built in a style that matches Slode architecture. The Abyssal Cabal consists of 4 Sea Slode: Katora, Bakorgan, Zmaja, and one other, each of them with a distinct specialty and role in the plan. Their plan is patient, it is layered, it is a masterwork of long game manipulation. They find the Sapiarchs of the Crystal Tower, the most elite magical scholars in the Altmeri world. And using Ktora's mind magic, they take over the Sapiarchs' leadership and turn them into what effectively become mind-shaping agents. The Sapiarchs are now unknowing instruments. They start using mind magic on the inhabitants of the Somerset Isles under the cover of helping people deal with stress and anxiety. Slowly, over time, building up control without anyone realizing there is control being built, Bikorgan runs a parallel operation in Wellanking Cove. He has taken the Yagra, crustacean creatures that serve as the Sea Slode's main workforce and soldiers, and is breeding them into more powerful forms. He has also started a program called Flesh Crafting, giving Altmer aquatic features and biological weapons under the cover story of enhancement and improvement. The Altmer being urged to join this program do not know they are being prepared for an invasion of Tamriel as hybrid soldiers. Zmaja is running the third track of the operation. She has taken over the city of Cloudrest at the top of the highest peak on Somerset and established herself there as a teacher of shadow magic. She is training cadres of students. The purple mist she surrounds the city with becomes a symbol of her control. She has taken the Welkinars, the Gryphon-riding knights sworn to protect Somerset, and turned 3 of the 4 of them into shadow thralls. The entire operation runs for what would have been long enough to complete the capture and subjugation of Somerset if the player character in ESO had not gotten involved. 3 separate assault vectors: mind control, body modification, military preparation, all patient, all slow, all coordinated, all built on the Slode, understanding that by the time anyone can perceive the trap, it should already be closed. The Yagra are worth a note here because they are fascinating in themselves. They are crustacean creatures, like crab, and lobster ancestors crossed with something deeper. The sea Slode created them from bottom-feeding sea creatures. They use them as soldiers and servants, directing them through a combination of the Slode language and mind magic. Yagra Striders, one of the more advanced forms, apparently revere the sea Slode as gods. Whether that reverence is genuine or whether it was engineered into them by the same mind magic the sea Slode use on everyone else is an open question. It is probably the latter, but the outcome is the same: perfect loyal soldiers who see their commanders as divine. Let's talk about where the Slode fit in the Elder Scrolls origin stories, because there is one thread here that does not get a lot of attention but is genuinely interesting. In the deep mythology of the Elder Scrolls universe, there are beings called the Beast Folk, the aboriginal peoples of Tamriel from its earliest ages before the elves arrived. The Beast Folk include the Khajiit, the Argonians, the Imga, the Slode, and others, and they predate the elvish migration to the continent by an enormous span of time. The Slode, specifically, are noted in the Pocket Guide as the tribe of beastmen native to Thras, which places them in this most ancient category of Nirn's sentient races. Even more interesting, the Slode may originally have occupied Somerset, or at least part of it. Those oldest coral ruins on the island are built in a style that matches Slode architecture, and they sit at impossible distances from the sea, which suggests the Slode were there first. Before the Aldmere arrived from Aldmeris in the early Merethic era, the coral structures suggest prior inhabitants. Vivek himself, in one of his more cryptic references, says that during the first of the Altmeri Form Wars, his people besieged the necromantic meat merchants of Thras. The Altmeri Form Wars are mythological conflicts from the earliest ages of Elvish history, so ancient that by Vivek's time they were already more mythology than history. But the implication is that the Slode and the elves have been at war since literally before recorded time, the oldest enmity in the Elder Scrolls. This history shapes why the Altmer of Somerset have such a particular hatred for necromancy as a practice. Every Altmer scholar who writes about their people's animosity toward the dark arts traces it at least partly to the Slode. Millennia of the Slode conjuring sea monsters along the Somerset coast, laying siege to cities like Skywatch, stealing Altmeri captives. That specific kind of trauma, ongoing over centuries, leaves marks on a culture's collective attitude toward the things that caused it. Necromancy for the Altmer goes beyond philosophical controversy. It is deeply personal. It is the thing the enemy did to them for as long as they can remember. Now let's talk about the behind-the-scenes stuff, because the real-world origins of the Slode are genuinely delightful. Michael Kirkbride, one of the developers of Redguard and one of the most creatively significant people to ever work on the Elder Scrolls setting, has said explicitly that the Slode's design is based on Jabba the Hutt. He wanted to draw Jabba. The Slode were, at least aesthetically in their original conception, Jabba the Hutt transplanted into a fantasy setting. You can see it the moment you know it. The corpulence, the slug-toad hybrid, the sheer mass of them, the visual DNA is there. Ken Rolston, another key figure in the development of the franchise, had the conceptual idea for Thras. His conception was based on a worldview of sentient coral reefs. He was thinking about what a civilization built by something that was itself partially a living coral structure might look like, and that thought process produced Thras. The idea that the archipelago itself might be a living thing, which feeds into the lore theory we discussed earlier, comes directly from the conceptual framework Rolston built. John Pearson, who voiced Engasta in Redguard, was the lead artist on the game. His day job was making art, and his throat got sore after recording the dialogue. The voice of the most significant individual Slode in the entire series came from someone who had never trained as an actor, doing his best Slode necromancer impression, and what he produced somehow ended up being one of the most memorable villain voices in the early Elder Scrolls games. His love of zombies, noted in development documentation, was the specific inspiration for Engasta's necromantic specialization. There was also a cut concept for the original version of ESO's Somerset starting zone, where the Slode were working with the Meermer, the sea elves of Piandonia, to create something called Orgnavar, a false planet. This is so extremely Elder Scrolls that it almost makes you sad it got cut. Two of Tamriel's most antagonistic and ancient enemy races collaborating to literally manufacture a fake planet. For what purpose? To what end? We will never know. The Abyssal Cabal storyline we got in the final version of Somerset is excellent, but somewhere in a dev's discarded notes is a subplot about a fake planet made by slug people and sea elves. And that is a sentence I need you to fully appreciate. So where does all of this leave the Slode in the current state of Elder Scrolls lore? After the Thrassian War, Thras was devastated. Its population was gutted. Those who survived retreated into the deep. They never again attempted anything on the scale of the plague, but they also never went away. The Slode who remained began rebuilding, slowly, in the way only Slode can rebuild, which is to say with extraordinary patience and no particular urgency, because they understand that time itself is a resource. They built the Pillar of Thras. They continued their necromantic practices. They maintained their relationships with the Mormer. They traded, raided, and harvested corpses from the coasts of Tamriel on a scale too small to trigger another all-flags navy, but large enough to keep the coastal populations unsettled. By the Third Era, the Slode are a background threat. The Pocket Guide to the Empire, published in the Third Era, describes Thras and its inhabitants with a kind of grim, matter-of-fact tone, the way you might describe a chemical spill that has been there so long it is just part of the landscape now. Slode soap shows up in Morrowind. The dainty Slode shows up as a ship in Skyrim. The deep ones of Hackdirt show up in Oblivion. The Slode are never quite absent from the world. They are always just at the edge of things. What makes them so compelling from a lore perspective is that they represent a category of threat that the Elder Scrolls universe does not otherwise have in quite the same form. The Daedra are dangerous, but they are constrained by rules and agreements and the nature of Oblivion itself. The other races of Tamriel, even the hostile ones, are comprehensible. They want things that make sense. Power, survival, revenge, territory. The Slode want things that are harder to map. They want what is optimal according to a calculation that does not include emotional variables. And without the emotional variables, the whole equation looks wrong from the outside. The thing about the Thrassian Plague that no scholar in universe can fully explain is the choice, not the how, not even the when, but the why, the actual decision-making process that ended with releasing a disease that would kill half of all life on a continent. What calculation produces that result? What does the Slode side of that equation look like? If they wanted to invade Tamriel, a surviving population would have been more useful than a dead one. If they wanted resources, the living produce more of them. The most generous interpretation is that they wanted to weaken defenses before an invasion and misjudged the scale of lethality. The less generous interpretation is that they did not misjudge anything, that the goal was always this level of damage, and that the reason for it is something we cannot parse because we do not think the way they think. And that is exactly what makes them work as a lore element. The gap between our understanding and theirs. The evidence of sophisticated, deliberate, long-term planning applied toward goals we cannot fully read. The Slode run on a terrifying alien order, and the fact that we cannot see the pattern clearly comes down to one thing. The pattern was written in a language we do not speak. A few last things before we wrap up. The Slode relationship with the Marmer is worth a brief mention. The Marmer are the sea elves of Biandonea, who are themselves one of the more mysterious and underexplored factions in Elder Scrolls lore. They have been at war with the Altmer since ancient times. They can command sea serpents, and they are generally considered one of the greater threats to the stability of the Somerset Isles. The Slode have had diplomatic relations with them, two of the most deeply weird, ancient, and hostile to Somerset factions in the world with a functional relationship. What that relationship actually entails, what they have traded or shared or agreed to, remains undocumented in the lore. But the existence of that relationship is a detail that rewards thinking about. There is also the question of the Slode's connection to the broader tower lore. If the Coral Tower was a genuine tower of Nirn, what was its stone? What was it actually doing metaphysically before it was destroyed? The tower lore in Elder Scrolls connects to deep questions about the nature of reality in the setting, about how Mundus was created and maintained, and about what removing a tower means for the structure of the world. If the Coral Tower falls in that category, then the sinking of Thras was a metaphysical event with implications that are still rippling through the timeline, as much as a military victory. What the Pillar of Thras is trying to reconstruct might be an attempt to repair something in the fabric of reality that the All Flags Navy tore when it brought down that tower, something deeper than architecture. Before we get to the final thing, let's also talk for a moment about Negasta's book, because it is a genuinely strange artifact in the lore and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Ngasta, Kvata, Kvakis is written in the Slode language. That alone makes it rare. It is essentially the only surviving written text in the Slode language that turns up outside of Thras, and multiple copies show up across Vardenfell in Morrowind. The full content cannot be translated by anyone outside the Slode, but the fact that it spreads, that copies exist in a variety of places across the continent, raises questions. Who is making these copies? Who is distributing them? Is having the book itself meaningful in some way, the way a Daedric artifact carries power beyond its material form? The Hackdirt connection makes all of this much stranger. The Bible of the Deep Ones, that cult text found in the chapel of a town full of people who were sacrificing travelers to things in the caves below them, is drawn from this book. At some point, something under Hackdirt taught Irlav Moslin enough of the Slode language for a portion of Angasta's work to become the sacred text of a functioning cult. Whatever the Deep Ones were, they spoke the Slode language, or something so close to it that the overlap is essentially complete. So either Angasta had specific ties to whatever lived under Hackdirt, or the Slode language and this particular book carry some kind of resonance that goes beyond their surface content, something that draws people toward the deep things, toward sacrifice, toward exactly the kind of behavior that eventually requires an imperial response. Languages in the Elder Scrolls carry weight beyond communication. The Thu'um is a language that reshapes reality when spoken correctly. Daedric script channels power. The act of reading or hearing certain things in this universe can do things that go beyond communication. If the Slode language carries any of that quality, and given that it belongs to a race that built what might have been a Tower of Nirn, there is reason to think it might, then the slow spread of Ngasta's book across Tamriel amounts to something actively spreading in the world, doing something that most people will not recognize until it has already done it. That is a very Slode way to operate. And then there is the single most quietly chilling thing about the Slode that I want to leave you with. Not the plague, not the necromancy, not the elder distended one with its 3 extra eyes on its belly, eyes that opened again as toothless mouths. The Slode we see, the ones who interact with traders and conduct raids and appear on the coastlines and in the records we have access to, those are the young ones. The adolescents and young adults who can still support their own weight on land or in shallow water. The truly old Slode, the ones who have been alive for centuries or more, cannot come onto land at all. They are somewhere in the deep water of Thras, in the lagoon, in the underwater passages. We have one fragment of a journal describing what an audience with one of them is like, and that fragment describes a creature that the word grotesque falls completely short of capturing. The Slode we have seen throughout the entire history of Tamriel are, by their own species standards, the young and relatively inexperienced ones. What the old ones have been doing, what they have been planning, how long their timelines extend, and what the endpoint looks like, no outside scholar has ever managed to find out. The Slode word for adventure is tragic disaster. They have been sitting in the deep water for centuries, planning something. Whatever it is, they do not expect it to be a disaster. Thanks so much for watching this far. If you want more deep dives into the weirder corners of Elder Scrolls lore, subscribe and check out some of the other videos on the channel. The Slode are one of my favorite rabbit holes in all of Elder Scrolls, because they are this enormous presence in the history of the world that most players only ever bump into through soap and a ship name and one encounter in a game from 1998. But the actual depth of what they are and what they have done and what they might still be doing is something that rewards every hour you put into finding out. See you in the next one.